Cathy, welcome to our AI Predictive World series with SalesChoice, and really a pleasure to have you on our show today. Cathy, really would love just to appreciate your roles and responsibilities at Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young has done, from what we can see, a fabulous job positioning the need for global trusted AI. And I really would love to hear, the responsibilities that you have in this global coverage.
So, I've been, working with EY for over 25 years, and for most of that have focused on the risks of technology. So it's always been a part of what I've done with our client base. But about 2.5 years ago, I actually started to really research into artificial intelligence. It was starting to come up just at the periphery of my conversations with clients, and I really didn't know a lot about it or the risks. And as I got into it, I realized that it is a very different technology than traditionally which has been more rules-based. And with that, that brings new risk and controls. And I just didn't think that there was a real fulsome conversation happening in public, at my clients. And so I really started to dig into it. And so very quickly, I was asked to take on the role of EY's global trusted AI leader. So really working across all our teams, whether it's the consulting group or the assurance group or tax or strategy, really thinking about, as our clients start to move down their AI journey, what do they need to be thinking about their governance practices? What kind of controls need to be in place? How do they think about getting independent validation or audit over these technologies? And what are some of those risks as these technologies start to integrate with other technologies, the traditional rules-based, the Internet of Things, blockchain? And so it's really been a really interesting area to be involved in for the last couple of years, and one that just keeps evolving, and there's just always something new to learn.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for sharing that, Cathy. One of the things I wrote an article a couple weeks ago for Forbes and highlighted, to board directors and CEOs, where are they in terms of managing their algorithms? And so I was really curious, when you go into your client accounts, do you see their readiness in terms of having a clearly defined list of where their AI models are, the roots of who developed it, the nature of the, let's say, the last training date, and really having even a third-party audit review of their practices? And I wanted to get a sense of what you're seeing out there in your client dialogues, industry dialogues, to drive more robustness, because from what we can see, it's a huge pit of poor practices right now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've spoken to global clients in all regions, in all sectors, and I've yet to find a client that is really got a robust inventory management system around their AI systems. Most of them are just at the beginning journeys of their AI roadmap, and some of them have already started proof of concepts. They've got advanced analytics that have migrated into machine learning algorithms. They may have some robotics process automation that they're now, connecting with natural language processing, or, with OCR. So there's quite a few starts that our clients have taken along their AI journey, but I really see that a lot of the governance and control practices are not keeping pace. And if you think about the technical nature of AI and how it's accessible, so AI can be a very technical area if you want to build an algorithm from scratch, but so much of those algorithms have now been built and are available, for free from open source through some of the technology companies. There's a lot of online courses that are available to teach someone, even in a weekend, how to start doing a fairly simplistic algorithm in R programming or Python. And so the reality is that AI are coming into these organizations from a very different intake mechanism than they're used to. They're used to technology coming in through really big ERP projects, expensive licenses. And so there's governance practices that have been in place, gating systems to catch those and to have them then go through all the appropriate governance. But because a lot of these AI systems are coming in through free channels, through very low cost channels, they're very small models, not that expensive even if you are licensing them. And so they're not necessarily getting caught by these traditional technology governance practices. And so I think there's a lot more in organizations. And as I start to meet with senior executives and boards, you can tell that they're getting anxious. that they don't know that they've got a good handle over what's across their organization. And so, we at EY have actually been working with, one of the asset management organizations to think about how can you develop a more automated inventory system, because a lot of my clients are trying to do it through email inventory manual systems, and they're just too time consuming, they're incomplete, they get outdated very fast. And so I think to really have a good robust system, you're going to need that more automated inventory management system.
Do you
And
see, do you see the inventory management, like when we look at the machine learning operations infrastructures, and I believe you're using Data Robot, they do allow, to classify the models, the last revision date, but they don't seem to have, from what I can see, an approval process built into the life cycle. It's really thinking through what information you need to collect to manage risk, and like you say, on the inventory management side. But maybe there's pockets of things that are beginning that are integrated to the whole machine learning ops life cycle that need to extend, right? So any thoughts on there? And also, who's setting the standards? Because who's leading, to advance our thought process on what information we really should audit against?
yes, I think those are all really good questions. From your first question, there definitely is a need to create a more end-to-end machine learning DevOps, or AI DevOps process that really does, from the very beginning of setting up a project, getting all the business approvals, the funding, understanding business requirements, all the way to end of deploying it and putting it into operation, monitoring it. And right now it's a very piecemeal type of system. They're really trying to right now leverage a lot of the traditional development life cycle, and AI just has a very different kind of path. And so, I think that there are organizations that are working to try and create that end-to-end. And what we've been doing is actually working with them in order to not only think about the technical aspects, but also the business requirements and the control and the audit requirements, and ensuring that you're not just thinking about technical attributes, but also those trusted attributes. And so it actually really is quite complicated when you think about all the different elements, but we have to start somewhere. And so I think that versioning control, creating some of those, the data lineage, the understanding all the different versions and the inputs into algorithms, because there's this misnomer that an algorithm is just one set of code, where really it's like amalgamation of a whole bunch of different code pieces, I'll call them, which basically can come from different lineages. It could come some from open source, some could be built in, some could be licensed. And so it's really that versioning control is also can get quite complicated when you have all these different components coming in. But I think it's necessary, and certainly organizations that have moved beyond pilots and are now wanting to create more scalability are now recognizing that this is a need. And with all of that is going to then come also the audit requirements, and that documentation and those audit trails is what is needed in order to create the evidence that can then be audited. But even auditing is going to have to change, because it's traditionally been a very manual process, and all of this has to be automated with the scale and the speed at which we're expecting AI systems not only to get developed, but to be iterated and to be continually advancing in its functionality. We're going to need a lot more automated controls and monitoring in place.
Yeah, or do you see organizations like either IEEE or ISO, are they working closely with the audit firms trying to advance some evaluation criteria for, sound decision making?
So definitely, I'm more familiar with the IEEE because I'm on their certification standards development group, and certainly there's a number of us from the accounting firms. And I also work in Canada with our own standard setters in the CIO Strategy Council, and I always say that one of the biggest roles of those of us from the accounting firms, the auditing firms, on these advisory committees is to make sure that the standards and the criteria are auditable, that they are very crisp in regards to the requirements, that there's not that vagueness, that you can clearly determine what is the requirement and how you might evidence it. Because I think that's really important. I think you need to have a lot of multi-stakeholders in building these standards. We certainly need the technicians because they need the data scientists because they need to help us translate some of these requirements and ensure that what we are developing is actually possible
Right.
over these AI systems. But you also need those from the business context, the user context, that bring in what their objectives are, what are you trying to ultimately achieve, and then those of us that can look at it from a validity of the standards and their auditability. So it's a really interesting group of people to be working with and many different perspectives, but I think what's been developing. And so I think, though, from what I've seen on all of the timelines I've heard, whether it's the ISO or the IEEE or some of the, I think that anything auditable will probably at least another year out. And then even having the standards is only one piece of it because you then need to have the assurance standards. So how are you going to actually, assure this or certify it? What will be that standard? What will be the qualifications and credentials of that independent group that does these audits? And is there a certification program, an accreditation program? How are you going to? Are they going to be just for management? Are they going to be for the board? Are they going to be for end users? So there's actually still quite a lot of things to be kind of worked out, but a lot of interest in the market to get to end state on having some kind of assurance model over these AI systems. So I think everyone's moving in the right direction, and everyone's kind of playing their part, and hopefully over the next year we'll see all those parts kind of come together.
Do you think the European market, do they have clearly defined audit standards? Obviously they were very progressive with the AI ethics principles, trust-making concepts, but in terms of the audit delineation, are they ahead of us in North America? Any perspectives on a global scale?
So I certainly think that Europe, with the European Union's trustworthy principles and the OECD's, I think that there is more principles that are out there, but I still think there's another level or two to be developed before you get to an auditable standard. So I think they're probably more aligned in regards to having a greater group of countries that have agreed to certain principles and standards, and now they're all working towards going to that next level. But I would say right now that with everything I've seen, I'm not sure there's an auditable standard out there right now that really has the success criteria defined, the ambiguity resolved in some of the standard statements. And so I think, there's a lot of people working towards that, but in regards to it to be auditable, I think there's still more work to do. I also think there's more work to do in the organizations themselves, because I've worked with a lot of organizations and I think there's still gaps to be remediated. And so I think that's also a barrier to getting to an end audit, because there's going to be gaps there that have to be filled first.
Yeah, for sure. Lots of complexities. You think about when the airline industry started to move in, how many rules and regulations and inspection practices and processes, and given AI certainly is infiltrating most everything and will continue, this is an area where a lot of thoughtful, experts need to come together. I'm curious, obviously the financial services is identified as one of the largest investors in AI smart tech, and they've been applying AI algorithms obviously in the wholesale bank, in the money markets, in derivative trading, and lots of trading algorithms. Do you see that because they usually have mature audit practices, they have better controls for model and versioning, or are they also caught off guard a little bit because things have kind of slipped in, not necessarily going through maybe their traditional practices?
Well, certainly I would say that they are the most advanced sector in regards to looking at the risks and controls of AI, and I think that does stem from their decade-long requirement to have to meet regulations with a lot of their capital and financial analytic models. But I think they too are also kind of struggling with scaling what they've traditionally done over model management to broader use cases of AI, like going into the customer modeling and lending and front office and marketing and branch optimization. Like that just traditionally hasn't been the scope of what their model management was applied against. and it's very labor intensive, and it's more periodic. And so needing to scale it for AI will require a lot more automation, a lot more frequent, maybe even sometimes almost continuous, monitoring of some of the models, especially the most adaptive ones. And so I do think that they are also needing to kind of relook at the way that they've structured their model management so that it can scale to this broader set of use cases and in a much more shorter duration in regards to needing to revalidate maybe some of these models. But they're certainly farther ahead, and they actually are the sector that many others are looking to kind of see how they can build this out. The public sector has also been quite involved because they're in some cases standard setters. They see that they need to be a good role model in regards to how to utilize these AI. And there's also a lot of opportunity to use AI in the public sector. A lot of call for using AI for good, but they want to do it responsibly and be trustworthy from the very beginning, even in their pilots. And so, but they are also just kind of, they've been able to put out some guidelines, like Canada, for example, has their governmental guidelines for the use of AI, which, as the risk and impact accelerates, it does require that you would get independent audit and validation in place. But they're still trying to figure out the implementation of that. So the standards are in place, the expectations are in place, but thinking through how that would actually implement and what good looks like when it's just so early on in this risk and control journey, it's still a struggle for them as well.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that we've observed is even though you may have tracking the version and control of the models and, sort of the clearance and the validity, the reality is that the business process side where the end users are, where they are, maybe they're also monitoring the accuracy of the outcomes, they then want to add another data set and another data set. And sometimes some of the controls are actually in the local line and not necessarily, like when things are approved, that, obviously, your point earlier, you've got to have tight inspection processes every time the model is checked in and checked out or augmented. And sort of that last mile of value realization monitoring also seems to be a bit of a gap as well. I'm curious, one of the things that you see all the time, Cathy, is the concerns on data bias and the risks that, we anticipate from a legal perspective or even liability insurance, because a lot of the insurance, director liability insurances don't really have a clear call out on AI modeling risks and the practices. So I just really love your perspective, how Ernst & Young approaches audit and in relationship to data bias. Are you seeing that, even though we might not have the full life cycle, but companies are recognizing they better get, a third-party opinion on the legitimacy of that data set? So what's happening that you can see on data bias?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just kind of reset that EY is currently just doing audits, mainly for management as part of mostly internal audit projects. So we have not gotten to the stage where we're providing any kind of opinion on the functionality of these systems, partly because the standards that we would evaluate them against are still in flux, but also, that companies' systems themselves just quite aren't ready yet. So a lot of it is more providing advice and consulting to management. But when we do that, a lot of it is really trying to translate from the definition of bias from a scientific data science perspective, which to be honest has been around for decades. There's a lot of tests and ways to measure bias, whether it's at the data level, the algorithm, the outcome level. But what I think the biggest challenge right now is how to translate those measurements into bias or fairness from a business context. If you measure an algorithm's outcomes, you recognize that you've got outliers, maybe those where it's a minority class, decision framework does not work as well for them. That could be a manifestation of bias if that's like a credit lending algorithm. And those minority classes are a race class that, for example, has a low data set. Maybe they don't have great historical banking records. Maybe there's been a historical bias because of underemployment or undereducation, which has been manifested in the data that the algorithm has been trained on. For many number of reasons, it could be that minority race class is being discriminated against in regards to that credit lending outcome. From a scientific perspective, they know exactly that bias is manifesting itself. They know to what minority classes, to what feature characteristics, but it's how do you translate that now into a business context? So how does the credit lending executives decide, okay, have we crossed the line in regards to a discriminatory practice? What does that mean then? What kind of exception routines do we have to put in place? Do we have to kind of pull that minority group out of that algorithm credit lending, and they're now done by our credit adjudicators? How do we flag the fact that we know that this historical bias exists, and making sure that it also doesn't manifest itself into even the human credit adjudicators? And to me, I think that's been the real struggle, because there's certainly good measurement on bias in the scientific, a lot of call within business and the general public to have unbiased decisioning. But be honest, there's a bit of miscommunication as well, because there's this general call to just remove bias. Well, the reality is you need some level of bias in any decision. That's how you're making a decision. You're actually, favoring one feature or set of characteristics over another, and that's how you're deciding to make your decision or your prediction. So what you need to be thinking about, what is that unintended bias? What is that bias that leads to unfairness or illegal decision making? And that can get a little bit more difficult and harder to kind of translate, but that's really where we need to get to. And so although you can come up with a whole laundry list of types of bias, what you really need to do is to look at each of those in relation to your particular algorithm, the objective you're trying to achieve, the outcomes that you're going to come with, the stakeholders that are impacted, and think through each of those and really challenge, could those manifest here in this situation? And if so, what could that look like? And how can I monitor if that starts to manifest itself? And how do I then react if it does manifest itself? Can I retrain the algorithm, or is that something that has to be exceptioned out of the more automated processing? And so that's where I think we really need to see a much better integration between the technical data scientists and the business users. And I think those are where the type of challenge questions that a board or a senior executive level can start challenging down to their innovation teams. They could be asking how closely intersecting they are with those business users. Who are those challengers sitting at the table doing the what if questions and constantly challenging the development teams? And I think it all comes down to accountability. Like ultimately, who is accountable ultimately for the decisions that are being made through these AI systems? It's going to be to those senior executives, the project sponsors, the board. And I think they need to recognize that accountability. Even if you were to purchase this AI system from a third party, it doesn't excuse your accountability for how it operates and the ultimate decisions that it's going to make. And so I think that's where, there still needs to be a lot better education and awareness of in both sides. What is the business context of bias and fairness for the data scientist, and how might those technically manifest themselves to the business users? And so it's a very often very well talked about topic, but be honest, I think it's just scratching the surface of the real dialogue and challenge that we still need to work through.
Yeah, it's interesting, and just summary of, that was pretty richly packed, but in terms of, data bias, in terms of being conscious of the bias inherent in the use case and doing a call out in terms of the risk and having that deeper dialogue, either to make adjustments or to accept, but to think through what are the potential risks. And that dialogue on the risk, from what we've been seeing in our deployments, isn't there. You have a discussion on the data quality. In our case, our software does definitely highlight the validity, and we have an audit trail, but bringing the deeper implications of any erroneous error of margin. Obviously, the statistical side gives you one context. Obviously, different use cases have higher risks, right? Like image databases or health or med tech in particular. I'd love to build on your point and have you share a little bit in terms of, where you see board governance, board directors accountability. I know that EY has invested a lot of thoughtful thinking on an AI ethics framework for trusted AI, and just where you see the leadership coming from. Like, are the boards asking for greater governance? Do they know the questions they're asking? How is Ernst & Young influencing those dialogues? And are we building better training programs for board directors as they, go through for their director accreditation programs?
Yeah, no, I think that educating in the board is going to have to come from multifacets. I think to date, boards are starting to recognize that as their organizations move into these emerging technologies, it's not just AI, it's also blockchain, Internet of Things, robotics, process automation. They're really starting to track all of their organizations' involvement with all of these emerging technologies. And their very first challenge is back to management. So they are getting management presentations as to what the organization is working on, how they themselves are bringing in these governance and risk and controls. I've also seen that they've actually started to task the second line, the group risk heads, as well as head of internal audit, to really start to recognize that this is an emerging risk to their organization. And for many of the larger institutions, this has now hit the top 10 risks. Now they've grouped them under emerging technology, but still, AI is at the top of the list of being challenged. And so the board is getting regular communications from management as to what are they doing and how are they working on this. I haven't yet seen or heard of any board that has actually brought someone in specifically with an emerging tech background. But if I think about it, they have been pushing for many years to bring more technology savvy to the board. And so, there might be at least one, if not more, people that have that broader technology background. And so they kind of bring that ability, but they're still going to have to self-study to kind of keep up with all the new emerging areas. Because if you think about with cloud and, all these emerging techs and digital, there is quite a lot of technology that's happening in boards. And so I think no matter what their background is, every board member is needing to have to start to get more comfortable with technology and the risks of technology in general. I do think that it is probably going to need to be some more formal training for the boards. There certainly is quite a lot that they can self-study through, just as you and I have done through, some of the online training courses, a lot of articles. If you look at a lot of the business magazines, so many of them are now covering on in every issue, something around this emerging tech. So, it's not like the information isn't out there. And so I think they probably underappreciate how they're getting acclimatized to this risks. So whether it's going to become part of the formal certification program, we'll see. There's a lot of topics now that boards need to be savvy in. And so I do think that they just need to keep asking questions, keep challenging management, because ultimately management is who's going to have to bring this to them and really demonstrate that they are meeting good governance and control practices.
Yeah, and Cathy, can you comment on your trusted AI framework? Because that creates a construct for governance and looking at AI in a trust-making manner as kind of giving you that strategic framework. And what are the main 5 attributes on your framework?
Yeah, so the framework really has kind of 2 levels. The first is at the enterprise level, really thinking about that broader governance, really thinking about the roles and responsibilities, accountabilities, policies and standards. So really how you're going to integrate AI governance into your broader technology and governance programs. Then you get into the detailed AI programs and projects themselves. And that's where we really built it along the trusted AI development life cycle. So thinking about the life cycle that either a built or bought AI system will go through. And so as we thought about, we've got 8 steps, and in each of those, we've got different risk areas. But each of those can align back to 5 attributes, which is that the AI system should be unbiased. It should be transparent in regards to its use of both the algorithm and the data. It should be interrogatable and explainable. It should also be resilient, which means it's trustworthy, safe from cyber attack. And then the 5th is performance. And performance is a really large one, but probably the least talked about one, which is that it should just work well. It should, whatever its objectives is, it should work well. It should be, appropriately monitored. And that just is table stakes to many, but it gets ignored actually in a lot of the dialogue. So we keep trying to push that 5th one. But those are the 5 that we focus on. And then kind of at the governance level, then you deal with, you know, the accountabilities and the roles and responsibilities and good supervision. So we try to kind of look at it from those 2 levels. And we've been starting to build in some tools. So that was originally kind of more of a framework and methodology. And now we've been building tools to really start to help in, you know, finding and developing the inventory of AI, how to do the detailed risk assessments and mapping to controls. And then lastly, the whole independent validation and testing. And so knitting all those together so that you can flow an AI system from one to the other is our next step.
Well, that's really exciting, you know, in terms of the pragmatism and operationalizing, you know, the construct and the whole life cycle end to end, and how imperative it is to do this well. Just want to say thank you, Cathy, for your time today. It was just, you know, chock full of interesting perspectives, you know, just in summary, sort of 3 key takeaways, I think, to our audience. I think number 1 would absolutely be that, you know, the industry frameworks are evolving, would be obviously a key point, that a lot of stakeholders are coming together. Nobody has it right, I think, would be maybe a second point to make. And I think the third point is that Ernst & Young does have a construct and a framework to guide you know, large, medium, small organizations forward. So I just really want to say thank you for your time today, offering a really good global perspective relevant for all business leaders, particular board directors, CEOs. The time is now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cindy. It's been great.